This is an interesting question about continuity. Phil asked about from the production standpoint, from the mix standpoint. So I guess we could both take this. Maybe I'll talk about it for a second. How do you achieve continuity over a whole project? I think the answers, as with many things, are different depending on what your role is, what the project is. If you're the producer of the whole thing, you have a different kind of control. If you're the mixer and you get a bunch of different producers coming in, maybe go on it.
I'd prefer, and this is very rare, like I'm mixing a couple of whole EPs right now, between 5 and 7 songs for a few artists. I don't have all the songs at the same time, they're still working. I think you can nail continuity if that's where your head is at, right? That's where your palette is at the same time. So if I could mix a whole EP in the same week, I think continuity comes organically then, because the same person is working on it with similar tool set. It could be a different producer, but that's my job, is to create cohesion. And that's rare, sadly. So thinking about that otherwise, go back to your other mixes that you did a week or two before this one and reference it for yourself. Don't reference something on Tidal or Spotify or Apple Music. Reference your own mix that you did on their song 3 months ago. This is going to sit next to that. I rely heavily on Dale Becker, my mastering engineer, for stuff like that, because you want to flow. You want a free flow. You don't want to necessarily only be thinking about that, because then you're going to try to match snare sounds and vocal EQs to things that the source material is completely different. Therefore, you have to manipulate that sound so much different to make it fit the vibe. It's like maybe there's more of an overall broad EQ that's done in mastering on that. This is something I think about with level. Is it really my job to be at the same level mix-wise the whole time? Yeah, it should be. I mean, we mixed the entire Khalid album in 2 weeks, and that was great because I was worrying about the level of everything all at the same time. Sometimes you forget where you came in, and you got to remember it. It's tricky. I think it's kind of what separates pros and amateurs in a sense, being able to come back to that spark and that understanding of where you were for this project. Always, when someone calls you and says, "Oh, it's deluxe edition," it's like, oh, okay, cool. It should still feel like it fit on the same album. What happened 6 months ago? So I think you constantly have to check yourself for cohesion. I think this goes back to how I started the conversation of talking about deleting a bunch of tools. Like, if you're using the same tools, that's a step in that direction, right? So a lot of that color box, you got the basic 8 Crayola crayons. There's only so much you can do with that in changing someone's sound, right? So I always come back to that. I'm not necessarily trying to change someone's sound. I'm trying to elevate it and embolden what they've already given me. So if the producer is already giving me something cohesive, say the same producer did 5 out of the 7 songs, my job isn't that hard. I don't have to overthink it. Now, when someone else gives me 2 other ones, that's easier to fit into that zone because I already have similar tools that are crafting and shaping those sounds into that world. So I'll use the import session data feature. I'll save chains. Now that Pro Tools can finally do that.
Yeah, right.
I'll save it with the artist's name, Quinn's vocal. And then I bring
a lot of that.
So Quinn has his own vocal setting for an entire album that I mixed for him. That's actually coming out on Friday, which is really exciting.
Nice.
And I think I mixed everything but one song, and like the vocals were recorded by different people, but he has such an identifiable voice that I wanted to make sure that. So I did think about it in that sense. But some of them have more effects than others. Some of them sound like they're printed in a room effect before they even got to me on this record. That sounds a bit 70s and kind of cool and wide and affected. Like, that's going to sound different than the dry mono approach to a vocal with no reverb. But how can they still exist in the same space? How do you EQ that to fit? How do you EQ the room out of something that's printed? These are things that are constantly on the mind of anybody mixing a whole project. Yeah.
So it sounds like the few fundamental elements to making things sound cohesive, the same team as much as possible. And if that means that if you're producing it on some level, your taste is going to be involved in all of it. And I generally don't worry about that now if I'm working on, I haven't done a whole album in a really long time. Not a lot of people are doing that these days. But when that does happen, it's it's hard to not make it sound cohesive. If you have the same person singing and the same person directing the sonics, it's going to kind of come out that way. I think these days, since that doesn't happen as much, and you as a mix engineer, you're getting things from a lot of different people. You have your tactics and your tools and your instincts and your taste, which will be consistent across all the things you do. So you don't really, I mean, it's like, again, it gets back to, let's develop taste, and that's how you make things sound cohesive and consistent. But then having a good mastering engineer that's consistent, that's something that I think, it's funny how many, and maybe this is another conversation for you and I to have off the stream, but I get questions a lot of times from new bands and new artists, or just people on a budget saying, do you know any mastering engineers that aren't super expensive? And I don't really. And that's, I think part of that is because mastering is a very intense, very specific thing that is expensive, and you really need someone good. And one of the reasons for that is it helps with cohesion. It helps with cohesion both across your project and between other records you might be referencing to. So mastering engineer, very important for cohesion. And then the interesting thing you said in there that I hadn't really thought about is the timing, where if you're working on a bunch of things over the course of a month versus over the course of a week, the things you do over the course of a week are going to be more cohesive. And whether that's writing, producing, mixing, mastering, whatever, if you compress the time frame, the way your ears are feeling, the way your heart is feeling, the taste you're in, what you're listening to, what the weather is like, all these things are going to affect. I mean, really, it's, you're in a certain space, and, if you're worried about cohesion, those are the things to think about. I think, the team and the timing.
That's a great example in the timing to talk about. I actually do this. Certain records feel like nighttime records for me. Certain records feel like morning records for me. Certain records feel like daytime records, right? So I'll categorize them in my head of what I'm feeling in what time of the day.
Ooh.
So yeah, I do that pretty often. It's like, ooh, this one feels like I should do late night. So I'll wait. I'll do it after dinner or just before dinner, sunset, something like that. So that can be across different artists. It doesn't have to be like, oh, this record in the middle of the EP feels like nighttime. It can be that, but it can be many different artists at the same time. Like right now, I think I have 7 different artists that I'm mixing for today, between this week, the rest of the week.
Yeah.
And think about which ones I want to do at which times of the day always.
That's very interesting. Yeah, there are definitely, when the sun goes down, the records sound different. This house I'm at now has lots and lots of really amazing windows and south-facing light, and the songs that I write at 2 p.m. here with lots of light and the beats that I make and the things I do are very different than if I were in a studio with no windows. I think, getting back to talking about environment and how those things are affected, time of day is really interesting. Man, that's a whole nother hour right there too.